led by Admiral West, Chief of Defence Intelligence, supported on his right by Derek Plumbley, Middle East Director at the Foreign Office, and on his left by George Joffe, who is a renowned academic studying Middle Eastern affairs, a fellow of the School of Oriental and African Studies, and Deputy Director and Director of Studies at the Royal Institute of International Affairs. The presentation will be started by Derek Plumbley from the Foreign Office.
Excellencies, gentlemen, please. I don't want to anticipate too much what Derek Fawcett will be saying this afternoon when he will be, I think, reflecting the broad view of the government on Gulf security as seen from the Foreign Office. So I will therefore try to be brief, to focus in on what I think we consider to be the immediate security threats to the Gulf. But I think it is right, by way of prologue, at least just to put it in context, to underline the extent of the UK's interest in and commitment to Gulf security. We have obviously very deep ties, historical ties with the Gulf, but there are also very close trading links and close human ties between the UK and the Gulf, which I'm sure will be explored earlier in the conference. And I think this government has concluded, as its predecessors concluded, that a threat to Gulf security is therefore a threat to the United Kingdom. Therefore we need to give some time and devote some effort to a close analysis of the threats as perceived from here, and to share our thinking on these threats, insofar as we can, with our partners in the Gulf and with our partners in Europe and in the United States. Rather more, I think, than for most of our European partners, is this the case. Historical and trading relations are obviously in some ways deeper than in the case of most of them. And I think it's also the case that we are better placed in terms of our defence dispositions and our relations to respond to threats as they emerge. And clearly, from the responses of successive British governments, there is a readiness to respond, although of course not alone in the present context of the United States and with other allies in coalition formation with Germany. Having spent yesterday at the ministerial meeting, rather than here, I think I can report that there was a pretty close identity of views, which you already heard this, and Mr. Alloway was certainly there to participate fully, between the ministers there as to the nature of the external threat to Gulf security. And I think that ministers who participated in that discussion felt that it was a little bit, and there are other formal occasions, but a little bit more freewheeling, open, as a discussion of the real issues. And certainly in the communique that we agreed as between the EU and the GCC, we were talking of fuller political dialogue leading to a strategic partnership between the EU and the GCC. And I think that is a welcome concept, and a concept which requires a good deal of exploration, but it's not a bad starting point. As I said, I think in our view, the immediate threats to Gulf stability and security are posed by Gulf states in the sense of Iraq and Iran, but external to the states of the GCC. And certainly we see the most immediate threat as being that posed by Iraq. I don't think we would consider that this was some sort of geopolitical given that Iraq should pose a threat to its neighbours in this way. It is true that its long-standing claim to Kuwait, the events of 1961, would suggest an element of instability which the Security Council has sought to expunge through the various resolutions since the last Gulf conflict. But that conflict and the confrontations since then with Saddam Hussein have served in our minds to underline the inherent instability and volatility of the situation, which has him, frankly, his regime, as a player. A different leader, with an emphasis, say, on reconstruction or development or whatever, might lead one to draw a different conclusion. But this is, I think, a continuing conclusion, in our minds at least, in respect to the situation we're faced with in the Gulf at the moment. Drawing the lessons of that experience over the past 8 years, experience for us, of course, over the past 8 years since the Gulf conflict, I think we would draw the conclusion that it is important to keep up the pressure on Saddam Hussein, to try, so I might say, to keep him in his box. Within that, there's been a particular recent focus, or recurring focus, on weapons of mass destruction. And I think this is, at some points, a difference of emphasis as between some Security Council members and some of our Gulf partners. Not a difference of view, but a difference of emphasis. And I think our conclusion is that if you look at a regime which has actually used weapons of mass destruction, and if you look at this continuing experience that we have of concealment, of trying to evade the investigations that UNSCOM and the IAEA have undertaken, of a continuing desire to protect Iraq's ability to develop weapons of mass destruction, we draw the conclusion that this is a real and present threat, and that it is right to focus on it, not exclusively. We think that there are other threats too that could emerge from Saddam Hussein's regime. It would obviously be a good thing if we would wake up tomorrow morning and discover that Saddam Hussein had somehow disappeared from the scene of the change of regime. But another conclusion of the last 8 years is that that is not in our gift. It's not something that we can determine. And so short of that, the policy has been and remains one of containment. Containment in which there are several elements, sanctions being the first of these. Now these are currently under a certain amount of pressure, I think, in the Security Council. And Council members have over time come to recognize the need for an effective humanitarian program to complement the sanctions regime itself, because the humanitarian exemptions in themselves were not funded. That, of course, has led to the oil food scheme. I think it's also the case that sanctions are a sort of contractual relationship of a sort between the Security Council and the target country. They're there for a specific and explicit purpose. And obviously, if there is movement towards the goal of the resolutions, then that progress needs to be recognized in order to encourage continued and further compliance. But I do not think that in the context of the present regime in Iraq that it is conceivable to imagine a situation in which the Security Council would wish to envisage reauthorizing rearmament, for example. There are clear no-go areas, I would have thought, in relation to that regime and its relationship with the Security Council. Another element in the policy of containment is clearly the threat of force. Certainly the government's view that in the last confrontation over weapons of mass destruction, without that present threat of force, there would not have been the diplomatic solution that was achieved. And an element of military containment with varying focuses, the no-fly zones, the military presence in the Gulf, is an important element in the overall approach. I think a third factor, or a third element in the policy of containment, needs to be some form, an emphasis on continued political isolation. We're not looking at a Gorbachev regime which might respond to a policy of openness or glasnost. It's better to sup with a long spoon. And better too, I think, to remind the world from time to time of the true character of the regime, with an emphasis on its past actions and its present performance. That regime is quite clever at playing off different international interests, one against the other. And I think it's very important that we try to achieve some sort of consistency in approach, and clearly Gulf states have a crucial part to play in promoting a sensible approach to the containment of Saddam's regime. In the longer term, obviously one can envisage and one can look forward to a different system and the reintegration of Iraq fully into the Gulf and the international community, its territorial integrity sustained, and hopefully a rather better approach to its people than that of the present regime. But it's difficult to imagine, difficult for us at least to imagine, such reintegration without a change of government in Baghdad. The other potential threat within the Gulf region is clearly Iran. There is a historic Iranian attitude of slightly possessive approach to the rest of the Gulf, a desire to dominate, and clearly there are religious interrelationships as well, which help to feed that. During the early years of the Iranian revolution, and with Iran clearly pursuing a policy of export of the revolution, it made sense to adopt an extremely cautious and conservative approach in respect to Iran, essentially the policy of dual containment, which as the Americans labeled it, in respect of Iran and Iraq. But there are, as has been discussed here over the past day, real signs of change in Iran following the election of President Khatami. And that government, Khatami's government, has extended olive branches both to its GCC neighbours and indeed to Europe, the European Union. I will be taking part in what is the first session of a resumed EU-Iran dialogue in the middle of next month. We have, within the EU, and certainly here in the UK, continuing doubts about some elements in Iranian policy. We're not convinced that they have renounced their desire to develop weapons of mass destruction. We'll probably hear more about that later. We are concerned about terrorism. These are all elements which are continually repeated in EU statements. I think this process of re-engagement with Iran could at any point be thrown off course if there were new terrorist acts which could be clearly ascribed to Iran and which would indicate that the forces of darkness, so to speak, were in that area at least in the ascendancy. But we do see the right approach as being one to engage with the Iranian government and to explore the way forward in a gradual, progressive way. I focused very much on Iraq and Iran because they do seem to us to be the present sources of instability, of threats, which is what I was asked to talk about in respect of Gulf security. The idea of a superpower threat has passed, but clearly it is an uncertain environment in which Gulf states operate. And one element of uncertainty is the impasse in the peace process, the lack of progress on any of the tracks of the peace process. And that, of course, brought with it in the last confrontation with Iraq accusations of double standards in respect of the application of Security Council resolutions. And on from that, there are questions raised in Gulf states about the Western military presence, the difficulty of reconciling that presence with a peace process which is not delivering the goods. I think it is right, whether you accept those arguments or not. It's right in itself for its own purpose, and also important in that context that we do try to push forward with the peace process, and of course that is very much an immediate priority of this government at this moment. It would be wrong to suggest, of course, that all the threats to Gulf security are necessarily external to the states of the Arabian Peninsula themselves. Clearly, to the extent that regional security arrangements of a local kind, based on the GCC itself, can be strengthened, this only serves to underpin better Gulf security, and that I think is important. Equally, it is important that within the Gulf countries, social, constitutional, economic policies are pursued which help to sustain stability. And we have welcomed, I think, in this context, the development of consultative mechanisms building on the traditional Shura approach in many of the Gulf states. It seems to us that this is a useful step in the direction of inclusiveness and helps to underpin stability and thus also security. Clearly, it's for Gulf governments to decide the pace of change, but such development is something in which their partners maintain, I think, a genuine interest. I think I will stop there and hand over to my colleagues who will speak more directly to the military question.
Her Highness's